It's Halloween, so we're going to take you for a ride through the freak show and check out some of the most bizarre bikes and tech that's ever happened in the mountain bike world. Some of this stuff is weird, some of this stuff is horrible, some of this stuff is hideous, some of this stuff is incredible pieces of engineering, and some of it was just before its time, I guess you could say, but all of it is positively freaky. Okay, so let's start back in 1991 with the imaginatively named Checker Pig CPX 3001. This bad boy, this very bad boy right here. Look at the shape of the bike straight out. It's vaguely mountain bike shaped, but look at that shock. It's a little bit different to what you might expect on a bike. It's a carbon fiber ring, I guess acting in the place of what a leaf spring would do, or at least I guess that's the theory from the German brand, and the same applies on the fork, as you can see on the images here. It's got one up front on the fork. Now, you might also notice there's absolutely no sign of a damper there at all, so that is just a sprung bike. Big spring, no damper. Alarm bells are ringing in my head, certainly, and probably are in yours too. Now, you might also have noticed it's got an incredibly high rear pivot on there, and there's no idler wheel with a chain going over that. You know what that means, don't you? Yeah, well. Okay, now it is over to the Slingshot team issue. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? So the story with the Slingshot is that the designer, Mark Cannondale, was basically riding a pit bike around some sort of motorbike race, and he had a crack on a down tube of his pit bike, and he noticed that the springy sensation of it enabled it, when it went over bumps, basically to kind of lurch forward as the spring would sort of close itself. So he got to work and designed the Slingshot. So on the top tube, as you can see here, there is a small piece of fiberglass clamped in between the seat tube and the top tube itself. And that's actually a portion of a leaf spring off of a Corvette. So it's immensely strong and it enables it to flex. And then the cable that's on the down tube has a spring just by the head tube, and that can pull it all back into shape. Now, the owner of this bike, he told us that he was out riding this bike back in the day, and he fired it into a ditch by mistake, an overjump, ended up in a ditch, and the back wheel nearly touched the front wheel before the cable pulled it back into shape and bounced him over the top of the thing. And although he does say the bike isn't exactly the best thing on earth, it definitely saved his life. This one scares the hell out of me. Okay, so this one on screen now is the Lawill Leader fork. Yep, it's a linkage fork, except this one dates back to the mid-90s. Now, the Lawill Leader fork was actually quite a good fork in its day, but it did suffer from a few things. Obviously, it was quite a heavy fork. There's essentially two fork blades there. And obviously there was a lot of bearings in there. So a lot of bearings to go wrong, a lot of bearings to go loose, a lot of bearings to develop a bit of flop in them. However, the action that the forks did offer, that definitely wasn't something that was on the freaky side. These things were actually really decent. I believe these ones had 3 inches of travel. There's a shock that sits in front of the head tube at the top there, and that's got your regular adjustability you would see on a typical shock with compression, rebound, and air pressure. Now, the thing with these is it had the same sort of action as a linear action as a telescopic fork, but it had the advantages of a linkage style fork, meaning basically it doesn't dive too much under braking. Your geometry stays fairly similar to what it is conventionally. So in those days, obviously that would have meant quite a lot because you had quite steep angles on the bikes. And also your trail didn't really change, so your bike stayed fairly stable as it sort of progressed through that travel. But nonetheless, it's a pretty weird looking piece of kit, and everyone's talking about linkage forks again at the moment, and I think they think everyone's pretty freaky if you've got a linkage fork in your bike, so this one belongs in the list. Okay, so this one is the Muddy Fox Interreactive, often wrongly called the Interactive. It's called the Interreactive, all in the spelling there. I think it came out in around 96, possibly 95. And it was designed by Dave Smart. You can see Dave Smart's bike, actually, one of his iterations on the screen right now. You can see exactly where this design came from. Essentially, it was a linkage bike. It had a linkage fork and had a linkage rear end on there with a single shock being actuated by the front and rear wheels. Now, it was often talked about in a way that by the time the front wheel hit a bump, the rear wheel would actually react to that bump before it hit it, but that wasn't really what happened. That's kind of a bit of nonsense. The concept behind using a single shock on there was it would have anti-dive properties. The bike would handle more like a rigid bike in the fact that whatever you did in the way of pedaling, the bike wouldn't react to it, but it would still have traction and comfort associated with a full suspension bike. Kind of quite ahead of its time, to be honest. I think it's a pretty amazing piece of engineering by Dave Smart. Unfortunately, when it went to this iteration, the Muddy Fox one, the interreactive that actually went on sale, the shock had actually moved to the front of the bike. And by all accounts, the fork did work quite well on this. However, the combination of the linkage design on this one and the fact that the shock was up front and not in front of the bottom bracket like the earlier designs that David actually designed, the rear end just didn't really work that well. It looked good from afar, but it was far from good. The Whyte PRST-1, designed by British brand Whyte Bikes. It was designed by John Whyte and Adrian Ward, essentially because they got bored in an airport. Well, I say bored, their flight was delayed because of a storm. Now, when that sort of thing tends to happen, I kind of relax and have a beer. But no, not these two. They got their Meccano out and they started addressing the issues of linkage forks and how they could come up with a better solution. Now, although this does look a little bit like the drawing I would do after I've had that beer in an airport, by all accounts, the fork was pretty phenomenal. It had zero stiction. It was very, very, very supple because of that linkage design and the shock that it used. It allowed constant geometry, constant trail under operation. It was very stiff under all situations. And it also had adjustable anti-dive features on it. So you could have it all the way from pro dive to anti-dive. Now the fork itself, obviously, looking at this, you can see this was part of the frame. It was a whole package. You couldn't just have this fork and bolt it on another bike. So the frame itself had a really cool monocoque construction to it. So it was leagues ahead in terms of construction, the way they had to do this thing. But the interesting thing, I think, is the name, the PRST-1. Apparently, it took its name from the dog from Wallace and Gromit, the mechanical dog called Preston. And I'd imagine that the guys kind of sort of looked at the dog and thought it kind of reminded them of their bike a bit, and the fact that, you know, it's dog-shaped and not really dog, and their bike's kind of bike-shaped but not really a bike. Well, certainly not as we know bikes now. This one is freaky as anything. Whoa, look at this one. So this is the Klein Mantra. Now, Gary Klein made some of the lightest early mountain bikes. The Klein Attitude, in fact, came out in 1990 and it weighed 20 pounds. It was an absolutely beautiful bike. And then he came out with this. So this thing was a suspension bike, as you can see here. And the cool thing about this, or the funny thing about this, is that in the early 90s, when suspension was actually considered that it was going to be a real thing that manufacturers had to commit to, it was kind of hilarious actually. It turned into a bit of an arms race, and a lot of manufacturers battled it out to come out with the best design or a different design or something that had a different USP to the next design that Hot Chili or Cube or whoever else was going to churn out onto the market. And it was a great time to be alive because there were some things like this that existed. Now, this was a unified suspension design. And the thing with unified designs was the whole point was to put the bottom bracket on the rear part of the bike, the bit with the pedals. So whatever you're doing with pedaling, you were not affecting your chain length or anything. So you could pedal as hard as you want and the bike would just go forwards. No problem. Now, the pivot point was crucial in how a bike handled well if you had a unified design. The lower the pivot, the better the rear end worked. It was more active. So the Trek I did the XTR video on way back, that one had quite a low pivot and actually felt moderately good. The higher you put the pivot, the more bipolar your bike design went. It went from working really well when you sat down, as soon as you stood up, it was basically a hardtail. Talk about a Jekyll and Hyde personality. Cannondale fulcrum. I go a bit bleary-eyed when I look at this thing. So this is from 1998 and this is absolutely bonkers. Cannondale, pretty much what they used to do was just pour loads of money into stuff and develop the most insane stuff. They were full bore or not at all. They just wouldn't be interested unless they could go whole hog, let the designers go mental on the things. That is why this one is part of the freak show. And just look at the thing. So out back you had a twin mini link system on there. Now this is one of the first bikes to have this, and it made for a famously plush back end. All the racers praised it for how well it stuck to the ground and how well it pedaled because of the fact it was almost zero chain growth thanks to that system. The downside though is the fact it was designed around a single chainring size because they didn't want to compromise on the suspension performance. So that was the right way to design a suspension bike for sure. The only downside was because of that rear end with those linkage, the chainring size they could fit was tiny. So how do you make a downhill bike pedal faster that pedals quite well but has a tiny chainring? Well, they developed this elaborate jack shaft system. It essentially had a chainring and it had a chain running to another chain set with a separate bottom bracket going through to the other side of the bike, and the left hand side chainring was actually the one that gave it the gearing for the drive side. That's a really elaborate way of doing it, but I kind of love the fact they did this because they had to put a big plastic fairing on it and made it look like a motocross bike. But the problem was all those extra bits of chain and bottom bracket and bearings and that weighed a lot. Loads in fact. So it weighed about 50 pounds, which is 22.5 kilograms. That's a seriously heavy bike to pedal. Surely kind of negating the fact that it pedaled well in the first place. They could have just done with another suspension design, surely. Kind of a bad one there from Cannondale, but also it's amazing. I've got to say, I absolutely love this bike. I think it's one of the coolest bikes ever designed, and I love the effort that they went to make it pedal. But that's what happened in that era. People progressed and people were trying everything they could to have a no compromise bike that would do the best things. And apparently, everyone still says, even today, it would hold its own on a really rough course. Serious piece of engineering from Cannondale, that. Brooklyn Machine Works. Wow, so this is the Super Trucker. This first appeared in around 1997. This was another brand that had a non-conventional approach, and as you could probably tell looking at the image, everything was made from steel. It had a steel 4-piece handlebar on there. Look at the pedals. It's got massive heavy-duty pedals called Schindbergers. It had steel profile BMX cranks on there with a steel axle on them. The frame was made from steel. And in fact, there's a subframe that's also made from steel. It's even got a motocross shock on there. It's got a jack shaft drive, kind of reminiscent of that Cannondale fulcrum that we looked at earlier in the video. And that motocross shock's even got a remote piggyback on there. There's a Monster T fork on the front, the huge thing developed by Marzocchi. And of course, it's got those massive wide profile rims and Nokian 3-inch Gazzalotti tyres. Now, whilst these things were a bruiser and pretty much indestructible, you could jump these off a double flight of stairs to flat, off the side of a house, or even off a volcano if you wanted. The problem was, these things were seriously heavy. I mean, this one, the Super Trucker, these weighed in around 65 pounds. That's about 29.5 kilos, and it wasn't even the heaviest one in the range. The heaviest one was called the Rubber Ducky, and it weighed over 72 pounds. That's nearly 33 kilos. Can you imagine trying to bunny up that thing? You'd bust a gut doing that. Mental. Okay, next up is the Lauf carbon fibre trailing link suspension fork. Now, these things were designed in Iceland by people that have got experience in working with prosthetic limbs. Now, these guys really know their stuff when it comes to carbon fibre, and this thing is as much of a work of art as it is part of a freak show. I think it looks absolutely fantastic, and don't get me wrong, it's a very bizarre looking part. It was designed initially to use on gravel bikes and road bikes and then fat bikes and mountain bikes, and has travelled from 30mm up to 60mm. There's not much in the way of wheel travel. You probably notice it doesn't have a shock on there either. This is completely undamped travel, and the actual springs on it are actually carbon fibre leaf springs, and they're military spec. They come off tanks essentially. These things are absolutely bonkers. But I've got to say, I have ridden a couple of sets of these. I've ridden the Grit most recently, the gravel fork, and although it's only got 30mm of travel, it works absolutely amazingly. Really quite surprised, and it doesn't feel at any point that you need a damper on a fork like this. I never thought I'd say that because this thing is a freak, but a kind of lovable freak. Spengle wheels. Now, this isn't something from the old days. This is a brand new wheel from them. It actually came out last year and is fully made from carbon fibre. Now, Spengle knows their stuff about wheels. They've been making wheels since the late 90s, and their wheels have always been a little bit different to the norm, but these bad boys, tri-spoke carbon fibre mountain bike wheels. The hub is incorporated into the design. It has to be because of the tolerances to actually bond this together. It's pretty impressive stuff. The rim is part of the actual wheel design on here. And here is the cool thing with these wheels. When a wheel goes out of true or gets bent, it's essentially because of the spokes, with these, it simply cannot happen. These wheels stay straight as an arrow. So if you can put up with those freaky looks, they might be the right thing for you. Me? Kind of on the fence. The True Bike 36-inch wheel bike. Yeah, you heard right, 36-inch wheel bike. Yeah, pretty much built for giants. Now these guys, when the 29-inch wheel thing was finally getting accepted, they came straight in with their amps rocking at 11 and went straight to 36-inch because the world needs a 36-inch wheel bike, clearly. Interestingly though, it's got some really cool tech on it. Look at the bar position. It's kind of like, reminds me of a GP bike, the way that you have your bars down low mounted as a headstock style system. Kind of has to be like that to maintain the riding position. It's actually pretty intelligent stuff. But here's the freaky bit, the wheels. It's got carbon fibre 36-inch wheels on it. Now these wheels were designed in carbon fibre for a reason. The alloy wheels on previous model weigh 10 kilos. 10 kilos for wheels. You're having a laugh. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how slowly that thing accelerated? Oh, I can't imagine actually. It must have been awful. But jokes aside, I kind of secretly like to ride one of these. I bet you could ride over a granny and you wouldn't even feel the tins of cat food. Trust Performance. Now they make a fork called the Message and they make a fork called the Shout. Now this is the linkage fork everyone is talking about right now. First came onto market last year and it's definitely a bit of a divider. It's the Marmite fork out there, the one that really does turn people off or massively pull people in to take a second look. Now it has 3 industry heavy hitters behind it, including carbon fibre mastermind Jason Shears and suspension guru Dave Weigel. This thing really is an exceptional piece of kit. Promises ultimate suspension action by allowing our axle path to move backwards and away from the bump. So whatever you ride into is simply gone. That's what it's designed to do. It also maintains your geometry. Your angles stay fairly similar. The trail actually increases under compression, which means it gets more stable, not less. It's a complete game changer in terms of bike handling and performance. It's a very, very different concept and simply cannot be compared to regular telescopic forks. Okay, so it's not everyone's cup of tea, but if you ask me, it is a work of art. But what it does require before commenting, really you need to disconnect your analytical side and just look at what the thing does. Pretty amazing. However, it's still a freak and it belongs in this show. Well, there we go. There is some of the freakiest bikes and tech around from yesterday and today. I'd love to know what you think is the worst thing, what you think is the best thing, what you think is the freakiest thing, what you think is something that actually has legs in it. Let us know in the comments below. Don't be too nasty. This is all a bit of fun, just having a look at some of the cool tech from over the years, but do comment underneath and let us know. Now, if you want to see that trek that I was referring to earlier when we were talking about the Klein Mantra, you can see that in my old versus new video with XCR over here. And keep your eyes peeled if you're interested in that terrifying looking Slingshot bike, the one with the cable down tube. There's going to be a video coming up all about that bike. As always, don't forget to give us a huge thumbs up here at GMBN Tech. Let us know what you think in the comments, hit the subscribe button and hit the little bell. Ding ding!